Tonight, $1 billion a week. That is the pay gap between Australian men and women. It's an age-old problem made worse by the pandemic. So what are the solutions? How do we balance the scales? Isn't it annoying when you find a stubborn stain? It's kind of like the gender pay gap. Stubborn, despite recent efforts. Investments in childcare, superannuation reforms and paid parental leave, it just won't budge.
The gender pay gap is complex. A lot of us sit there and go, well, my name's Jane and that's Jim and we're paid the same for the same job. The gender pay gap takes into account so much more than that.
Out of the blocks at the start of their careers, women are already 6% behind their male counterparts. And as they hit the straight, that triples to 18%.
The long-term effects of the gender pay gap on women cannot be underestimated.
Today, Australia's top 10 highest paid CEOs were revealed. Just 2 of them are women.
The CEOs. The CEOs make it even more depressing.
The driving forces in the general pay gap are systemic.
The gender pay gap is a deficit of $2.56 per hour.
Women take more time out to raise kids. That's 51 cents. They do more part-time work than men, 27 cents. And because of these factors, women tend to work in more caring and education roles. That's 50 cents, thanks.
Women in industries like healthcare, aged care, childcare, compared to men who might be in mining or construction. And as a society, we value and therefore pay less those feminised economies.
But the single largest pay gap contributor costs a whopping 91 cents an hour. That's gender discrimination.
What that is driven by often are things like unconscious bias, and that bias can affect a woman all the way through her career.
And the pandemic has supercharged all of the factors that work against women in the workplace.
Dad went into his office, whereas women had to take on a whole lot more. They were suddenly cooking more nights a week. They were doing all of the cleaning, and so they either cut back their hours at work or they left the workforce entirely. Childcare must be more accessible and more affordable. We set up a paid parental leave scheme publicly in this country back in 2009. We've barely fiddled with it since then, so it's not working.
Dr Emma Fuller is Director of the Equality Institute and she joins us now. Emma, I might start with that last point because a lot of the things that we've been told are needed to fix this, so cheaper childcare, paid superannuation on maternity leave itself or parental leave, they have started to be introduced. Obviously there's more that could be done, but some of that work should have been underway. Even so, the gender gap doesn't seem to be closing. Why isn't it moving?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, first of all, we do need to acknowledge that we still, unfortunately, don't have free, quality early childhood education. And the superannuation gap work to address that is really only just beginning. So I think those are still issues. But the other thing to remember is that they're only part of the problem. So what we see from this report is the fact that the drivers of the gender pay gap are actually primarily around discrimination. And so even though there's been movement on some issues, there's a lot more that we need to do.
What kind of gender discrimination are we talking here? Because people always fall back on the women work more part-time or they take more time out arguments.
Yeah, actually the work around the discrimination is referring to things like sexual harassment in the workplace, everyday sexism, unconscious bias in recruitment practices, even family violence, which we know really impacts on a woman's ability to work. So it's those things that are actually driving some of this gender pay gap. And I think the other thing that's really important to remember when we think about discrimination is that with this report, the data we have is just about the average Australian men and women. We don't actually have the data to look at the gender pay gap for First Nations women, women of colour, women with disabilities. And we actually know from the international evidence that the pay gap for those women is likely to be even greater. So we're not talking just about gender discrimination. We need to be thinking about racial discrimination and other forms of discrimination that are connected to gender equality as well.
So clearly a long road ahead. I think I was reading between 2017 and 2019, the gap looked like it was closing a tiny bit, but then the pandemic hit and women, you know, suffered there during the pandemic in terms of their financial hit. How do we get it back on track? How do you think we make up for those lost years?
Yeah, it's a real shame to see that we have, I think, gone backwards in a way because of COVID and the policies around that. And women really bore the brunt, I think, in many ways around that. And I think we saw that inequalities exacerbated during the COVID period. So I think we really need to take this seriously. I mean, we're talking about $1 billion a week that the gender pay gap represents. So this is a huge issue, not just for workplaces, but for all of us as a society as a whole. So I think the things we need to be addressing is this gender discrimination. So we need to be looking at, equal opportunities, addressing sexual harassment, addressing discrimination in the workplace. We also need to be addressing the fact that we have some industries, low-paid industries, that are dominated by female workforces. And the question is, why are those industries low-paid industries? Why is it that we value some of that work less? And I would argue part of that is because historically we've undervalued women's work. And the third area is thinking about the norms that drive the gender pay gap. So the fact that men are less likely to take up parental leave, the fact that women are still doing the vast majority of unpaid care work. So these are the social and gendered norms that are still underpinning these issues that we need to address as well.
Emma, thanks so much for your time tonight.
Thank you.